Hello and welcome to McKillop Library Online. Today we're going to be talking about how to create a research strategy for your college research. My name is Alicia Vandrang and I'm the Education and Instructional Design Librarian at McKillop Library. I'm a liaison to both the History and the Education Department, so it's my relationship with the History Department that's bringing me here to talk to you today. Now before we get started, I want you to take a minute and think about your previous approaches to research. I want you to consider these questions about how you've conducted research in the past. What sources did you look for? Where did you look for sources? How did you decide which sources to use? And how did you know when you were done researching? Now, if we were in the classroom, I would have us share these responses, but that's obviously not an option right now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the responses that I tend to get while you're thinking about your own experiences. When students talk about what sources they've looked for in the past, a lot of them talk about using websites. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of great websites out there. I usually have some students who also talk about using books, and then some students who talk about using articles. Now, when they're talking about articles, they've usually told me that they have used newspaper articles or they've used scholarly articles. We're going to talk a little bit more about scholarly articles in a few minutes. When I ask students where they've looked for sources, the most common answer that I'll get is that they've looked at Google or another search engine. I also usually get some responses from students who've used high school libraries for their research, which is fantastic. And in fact, I usually have several students who have used resources at their high school library that we also have access to at McKillop, which is wonderful because then you're using something that you've already used in the past. When I ask students how they've decided which sources to use, I often get a few blank stares for a few seconds, and then students realize that they have used strategies in the past to help them decide which sources are going to be the best for their research. Usually what I get here is students talking about how they choose the articles or the books that are the most relevant to their research or their research question if they have one. Some of them have also talked to me about thinking about the author's credentials and their expertise and if they should have that authority to publish on this topic, which is really fantastic. In a few minutes, we're also going to talk a little bit more about some strategies for evaluating sources. However, out of all these questions, the one that tends to trump students the most is how they knew when they were done researching. I sadly, but not surprisingly, get many responses about people ending up their research once they are just simply out of time to do more research and they have to write their paper. I have to confess, I've totally been in that boat before. I think we've probably all been there at one time or another. But usually the most effective ways to know you're done with your research is if you have a research question and you've answered your research question because you have enough research to support your answer. That's a good strategy. A lot of students also talk about how once they start seeing the same information over and over again, or maybe even the same references to other important works over and over again, that's how they make that decision about being done with their research. So those are all good strategies. Now, I always like to start with those questions because I think it's really important to remember that you have strategies in place for doing research. So what we want to do here is just build on those and kind of solidify them to make research even easier and more effective for you in the future. So what I'm going to recommend are these 4 steps to take as you're building into your research. So the first step is to figure out what information you need. And at this point, it's really important to think about the scope of your information need. If you're writing a 5-page paper, you don't need to find 50 sources. So what you have to do is you need to think about what pieces of information do you really need to help you write your paper. And then as you're finding sources, you're going to want to focus on using those that really help you by supporting you by giving you those pieces of information. In the second step, we identify what types of sources are needed. In the third, we determine what tools you need to find your sources. So this could be databases, the library catalog, search engines. And then in our fourth step, we select the terms, which in the library we tend to refer to as your keywords, that you're going to use to find your sources. So what we're going to do next is we're going to walk through each of these steps for your assignment. Make sure that we're all on the same page as we move forward and before we go into looking at the library catalog or the databases. We want to start off by asking what information you need. So what I've done here is I've summarized a lot of those questions that you have in your assignment prompt, and we're going to walk through these together make sure to look back at the prompt though as well as you are starting to find your research. So one important question you have is, what are the important background details and formative experiences of your activist? Now I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, this is a nice big broad question about your activist. Usually what you're going to find is that books are the best sources for giving you this type of information. You might be able to find articles that focus on specific aspects, especially in regard to those formative experiences of your activist, but it's not going to give you that same broad overview that you would get in a book. You also have to answer, how did your activist leadership style and philosophy align with MLK and Malcolm X? What ideologies drove your activist's actions and decisions? What was the legacy of your activist? How is your activist remembered? And in what ways could your activist's leadership style, goals, and philosophy be applied to issues today? Now, once you've thought about the pieces of information you need, you want to think about what types of sources you need for you to find that information. So often when we're talking about types of sources, we're talking about three primary categories. The first of those is popular sources. Now, popular sources are sources that are written for the general public. They don't require any expertise to really know or understand what's being said in the material. If you were thinking of popular journals, you'd probably think about something that was written and is being sold at like a newsstand. So something like Time Magazine and People Magazine, those are popular sources. When we think about trade sources, those are sources that are written for a specific trade or industry. So for example, if you were a student who was majoring in education and you were looking at trade sources, your sources would be written for current and future teachers. Now our last category are scholarly sources. And scholarly sources are written, big surprise, for scholars. They are often written by experts in the field, and they go through a peer review process. Now, what happens in the peer review process is an author or a series of authors writes an article, and they submit their article to a specific journal to be published. And then that journal sends it out to other experts in the field, and they review that scholar's article, and they look into the methodology, they look into the evidence that's being offered to support the author's claims. And then once they've looked at all of that, if they think that the research is sound and it should be published, then they pass it on to be published. If they look at it and they decide, no, there's these problems, or the author really needs to consider this other aspect, or they need to do more research into this other thing, they send it back to the author, and that author has to fix those changes before it can get published. Usually the peer review process is a blind process, so the people who are reviewing the material aren't supposed to know who wrote the material. And this is supposed to eliminate any type of bias or favoritism that could be shown in the field. Now, because this process is so structured and rigid, it tends to help you get more reliable sources, because it means that several experts have looked over the work itself and then decided that it should be published. Scholarly sources are great to use for your college research, and in fact, that's what you're required to use for this assignment. You're required to use 5 scholarly sources. So we're going to keep an eye on that as we are looking at our sources that are coming up. Now, once you've thought about what pieces of information you need and what types of sources you need, you want to go into thinking about what tools you need to find those sources. And this is why we need to do those other 2 steps before we get here. You don't want to start to do your research and jump immediately into a tool and then realizing you're not finding the types of information or sources that you need. So for this assignment, we're going to focus on 2 primary ones, although I'm going to give you a third one just in case you want to do some other searching on your own. So we're going to focus on using the library catalog specifically to find ebooks given our current health crisis. I'm also going to show you a couple strategies for how you might be able to access at least pieces of some of our print books too. We'll also talk about using the library database, America History and Life. It's a really wonderful resource for American history research. And I did put on here as well that Academic Search Complete might be another database that you want to try. My guess is that a lot of you have probably worked with Academic Search Complete, and even in format, it looks really similar to America History and Life. So I'm not going to showcase how to use that tool today, but you might want to do a little bit of that searching on your own if you're not having the best of luck in America History and Life. Now, the last step that we really want to take before jumping into those tools is to now identify what terms you're going to use to search for sources. Now, with this assignment, you kind of have a nice, easy one because obviously you need the name of the person who you're researching. So that should be your obvious starting point. You could also try adding in Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. because remember, one of those questions involves how do they fit within the philosophies and leadership styles of those two people. So that might be another term you want to try. You might also want to try searching for legacy with your person's name, see if anything comes up that way. So there's other things that you could play around with, but your first starting point should definitely be your activist name. And there is one last thing I'm going to have us cover before we actually start looking at the library catalog and the databases. And that is that we want to talk about evaluating our sources. So for evaluating sources, I tend to recommend what's called the CRAP method. And it's really cheesy. It's supposed to be because you're weeding the crap out of your research. When I first started teaching, I was like, I'm never going to be able to teach that with a straight face. And now I do it practically all the time. So the C in the CRAP method stands for currency. So you want to think about when your source was created, if it's current enough for your research, and if the information's been revised at all. Now, when you're doing historical research, currency doesn't matter in the same way necessarily that it does for other fields. For example, nursing, you obviously need the most up-to-date research on medicines and procedures. However, remember you're thinking about the legacy of your activist. And for something like that, you're going to want something that's more current, obviously, because you don't want to know what their legacy was, 20 years ago. You want to know what their legacy is today. The R in the CRAP method stands for relevance. Does the information relate to your topic? Who's the intended audience? Did you look at other sources before choosing this one? You don't want to find a source that only kind of quasi relates to what you're trying to say and supporting your arguments. You want to make sure that it's the best source for your research. The first A stands for authority. So what are the qualifications and credentials of the author or authors that make him or her a reliable source on this topic? So this is a really important one to ask when you're looking at your sources. You want to make sure that they have some credentials to support them publishing on this topic. You want to think about what type of sources that they're giving you to back up their arguments. The second A is going to stand for accuracy. So think about if the information is supported by evidence. Where did the information come from? How does the information compare with what else you know on this topic? I like talking about this one because you can also see this one ties to some of our other criteria here too, because when you're thinking about the evidence and how it's being supported, that kind of ties into the authority and what they're laying out from their research in the field. When you're talking about how does the information compare with what you already know on the topic, that's also kind of talking about relevance because you don't want to just focus on using one source. I also really like to point to this one because remember you're going to want to use a range of sources to help you answer your questions. You're probably not going to find one source that answers all your questions. And that's a good thing. You want to look for different perspectives and you're piecing the information together in a new way. And that's what makes it your own research. And finally, you want to think about what the purpose of the information is. Is the author of the source objective and impartial? Was the author funded or sponsored by anyone? These are important questions to ask. What is the purpose of the information is a really, really good one. Is it supposed to be educating you? That's what you should look for when you're looking for a scholarly source. It's going to be giving you new information to learn from. It shouldn't be made to entertain you because that's if we were looking more at popular sources, which you're not using for this assignment. So as we start looking for sources, think about these different criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and close this video out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another video of us doing some sample searching in the catalog and the databases. And I'll link to that at the end of this video.